Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato in late May 1942, reviewing intelligence reports that made him smile. American carrier strength in the Pacific, 2, maybe 3 flat tops. Japanese carrier strength, 11 fleet carriers, the finest naval aviators in the world, veterans who'd burned Pearl Harbor and crushed the British at Ceylon. His staff officers assured him the Americans were still reeling, still confused, still months away from mounting serious resistance. Japanese naval intelligence estimated the enemy would need until 1943 to rebuild. They were planning an operation for June 4th, 1942. The Americans wouldn't even see it coming. Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, read the battle plan with satisfaction. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru, carried 248 aircraft flown by pilots who averaged 800 flight hours each. They'd struck Pearl Harbor, devastated Darwin, driven the Royal Navy from the Indian Ocean. American pilots were barely trained kids with maybe 200 hours in the cockpit. Japanese torpedoes ran true at 49 knots. American torpedoes, intelligence reported, didn't work half the time. The math was simple. The outcome inevitable. Radio Tokyo broadcast to the home islands that Admiral Yamamoto was about to deliver a decisive blow that would force American surrender. Newspapers in Tokyo ran maps showing Midway as the stepping stone to Hawaii, to the West Coast, to final victory. In officers' clubs from Yokosuka to Truk Lagoon, toasts celebrated the coming annihilation of what remained of American naval power. 6 months into the war, Japan had lost exactly 1 major warship. The United States had lost most of its Pacific battleship fleet. Japanese war planners calculated they had 18 months, maybe 2 years, before American industrial capacity became a problem. They intended to win the war in 12. What Yamamoto didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort sat in a basement at Pearl Harbor reading their mail. Station Hypo, the basement code-breaking unit at Pearl Harbor, occupied a space that smelled of sweat, cigarette smoke, and mimeograph ink. Rochefort worked in a bathrobe because the air conditioning ran too cold, hunched over intercepts that shouldn't have been readable. Japanese naval code JN-25 was supposed to be unbreakable, but Rochefort's team had cracked enough of it, maybe 40%, to see patterns. A massive operation. Carrier force. Target designated AF. Messages about water supplies. Seaplane reconnaissance. A date, June 4th or 5th. Rochefort told Admiral Chester Nimitz the target was Midway. Nimitz, who'd taken command of the Pacific Fleet when it was still pulling bodies from the oil-slicked harbor, made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if he was wrong. He recalled carriers from the South Pacific. He positioned them northeast of Midway, exactly where Japanese planning assumed no American carriers could be. He scraped together every flyable aircraft within 1,000 miles. And he waited. The Japanese plan was elegant in its complexity, catastrophic in its arrogance. Nagumo's 4 carriers would strike Midway's airfield at dawn, suppressing American land-based aircraft. Then the invasion force would land 5,000 troops to seize the atoll. Yamamoto's main battle fleet, including the Yamato with her 18-inch guns, would wait 300 miles northwest, ready to annihilate any American ships foolish enough to respond. It was a trap designed to finish what Pearl Harbor started. The Americans were expected to react exactly as Japanese war games predicted. Too late, with too little, in confused desperation. But on the morning of June 3rd, 1942, 3 American carriers already sat in ambush. USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, the latter barely operational after the Battle of Coral Sea, patched with wood and prayers by Pearl Harbor shipyard workers who'd worked 72-hour shifts to make her seaworthy. Yorktown should have needed 3 months of repairs. She got 3 days. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, reported her ready for action, knowing damage control teams were still welding below decks. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Enterprise, and Hornet from Enterprise's flag bridge. He was a battleship admiral commanding carriers, promoted to the job 5 days earlier when Admiral Halsey came down with shingles. Spruance had never commanded a carrier in combat. Japanese intelligence didn't even know his name. He studied the position reports, calculated distances and fuel consumption, and made the kind of cold mathematical decision that wins wars. Launch everything at maximum range. If the Japanese carriers were where Rochefort said they'd be, American dive bombers would arrive with maybe 10 minutes of fuel to spare. If Rochefort was wrong, every American aircraft would ditch in the ocean, and the carriers would be defenseless. At 0430 hours on June 4th, Nagumo's carriers turned into the wind 240 miles northwest of Midway. Flight decks swarmed with armorers loading 550-pound bombs onto Nakajima B-5N bombers. The first wave, 108 aircraft, launched into darkness, forming up as the sky turned purple, then pink. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led them southeast. His orders: destroy Midway's airfield, suppress defensive aircraft, prepare the way for invasion. Below him, mechanics already armed the second wave with torpedoes for ship attacks. Standard doctrine. Carriers hold one strike ready for land targets, one for ships. The Americans had no carriers in the area anyway. Midway's radar picked them up at 0553 hours, 93 miles out. Every flyable aircraft on the atoll scrambled. 26 Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and Grumman F-4F Wildcats, obsolete fighters flown by pilots too green for carrier duty. 27 dive bombers. 4 B-26 Marauders rigged with torpedoes, 11 B-17 Flying Fortresses. The Marines on Midway knew what was coming. Most of them had never seen combat. They climbed into their planes anyway. The Japanese strike hit Midway at 0630 hours with textbook precision. Zeros shredded the Marine fighters, 17 shot down in minutes. The Buffaloes couldn't match the Zeros' climb rate or maneuverability. American pilots died learning that lesson. But the Marines on the ground had dug in. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Tominaga's bombers hit the powerhouse, the fuel tanks, the mess hall. But the runways remained operational. The defenses were still firing. At 0700 hours, Tominaga radioed Nagumo. There is need for a second attack. Nagumo faced a decision. His second wave carried torpedoes for anti-ship work. Changing ordnance meant bringing every aircraft below, unloading torpedoes, loading bombs, returning aircraft to the flight deck, 90 minutes minimum. But Tominaga said Midway needed another strike, and Japanese doctrine said Midway had to be neutralized before the invasion. At 0715 hours, Nagumo gave the order, rearm for a second Midway strike. Flight deck crews swarmed the second wave aircraft. They removed Type 91 torpedoes, the ones that worked, unlike American Mark 13s that ran too deep or broke apart on impact. They rolled them to the hangars, stacked them against bulkheads, and began hauling up 550-pound bombs. It was dangerous work, done quickly under pressure. Standard procedure in the Japanese Navy. They'd done it dozens of times. At 0728 hours, a PBY Catalina radioed a message that changed everything. Enemy carriers. The floatplane had spotted the American task force 200 miles northeast. The report was confused. Maybe one carrier, maybe more. But carriers meant an immediate threat. Nagumo's staff erupted in controlled chaos. They had to recover Tominaga's strike wave returning from Midway. They had aircraft below decks, half rearmed. They had torpedoes stacked in the hangars. And somewhere to the northeast, American carriers launched strikes that were already inbound. Nagumo made his second decision. Recover the Midway strike first. They were low on fuel, circling overhead. Then launch immediately against the American carriers. The crews below decks received new orders. Stop loading bombs, reload torpedoes. They'd already spent 45 minutes swapping ordnance. Now they reversed course. Torpedoes came back out. Bombs went back down, and both sat in the hangars, armed, unstacked, ready to explode if anything went wrong. 300 miles away, Spruance had launched his strike at 0700 hours. 156 aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet. Every flyable plane. At 0800 hours, Yorktown added 35 more. The American formations were ragged, poorly coordinated. Different squadrons flew different courses. The torpedo bombers flew slow and low. The dive bombers flew high, but couldn't find the Japanese fleet on their initial heading. The fighters burned fuel trying to escort bombers that flew at different speeds and altitudes. It was exactly the kind of uncoordinated mess Japanese war games assumed American attacks would be. But mess and desperation can look like tactical genius if you squint. Hornets Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, 15, Douglas TBD Devastators led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, found the Japanese carriers at 09, 18 hours flying alone, without fighter escort. Waldron's pilots could see all 4 carriers in a box formation, flight decks crowded with aircraft, destroyers churning wakes in protective screen. They could also see 30 Zeros climbing to intercept them. The TBD Devastator cruised at 115 knots, turned like a truck, and carried 1 torpedo that ran at 33 knots if it ran at all. The Zero climbed at 3,000 feet per minute and carried 2 20mm cannons. Waldron pushed over into his attack run anyway. The Zeros hit them from above and behind. Ensign George Gay, flying tail-end position, watched the plane ahead of him explode. Then another. Then another. The Devastators couldn't maneuver, couldn't run, couldn't defend themselves. They flew straight into the wall of fire, because that's what torpedoes required. Steady course, low altitude, close range. Zero pilots shot them into the water methodically. At 09:25 hours, Gay's aircraft took cannon fire through the left wing. His gunner stopped returning fire, dead in his seat. Gay held course until he was 800 yards from the carrier Soryu, dropped his torpedo, and pulled up as his plane disintegrated around him. He splashed into the water. Behind him, 14 other TBD Devastators burned on the ocean surface. 15 planes launched. 1 pilot survived. The torpedo missed. At 09:40 hours, Enterprise's VT-6 arrived from a different direction. 14 Devastators, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. They'd found the Japanese fleet by following the cruiser's wakes. Same story. Zeros swarmed them. Lindsay took a 20mm round through the cockpit 2 minutes into his run and kept flying. The TBDs dropped torpedoes from minimum range. Most of them never pulled out of their runs, shot down before they could climb. Lindsay made it 200 yards before his plane hit the water. 10 of 14 Devastators destroyed. Every torpedo missed or malfunctioned. At 1,000 hours, Yorktown's VT-3 came in. 12 more Devastators. They at least had 6 Wildcat fighters for escort. Didn't matter. The Zeros killed the Wildcats first, then methodically destroyed 10 of 12 torpedo bombers. The 2 survivors limped away with shredded airframes. Another 12 torpedoes in the water. Maybe 1 ran true. It missed. In 40 minutes, 3 American torpedo squadrons ceased to exist. 41 aircraft launched. 6 returned. The Japanese carriers didn't have a scratch. They'd shot down the attackers the way their doctrine said they would. Easily, efficiently, with minimal effort. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo's staff allowed themselves brief satisfaction. The Americans were brave but incompetent. Their torpedoes didn't work. Their tactics were suicidal. Their coordination was non-existent. Below decks, Japanese crews finally finished rearming for the carrier strike. Nakajima B-5N bombers now carried Type 91 torpedoes. Aichi D-3A dive bombers carried 550-pound bombs. Zeros topped off fuel tanks. The strike was ready. Tomonaga's Midway wave had landed and been struck below. The flight decks were clearing. They needed 5 more minutes to position the strike aircraft, warm engines, and launch. At 10:20 hours, Nagumo ordered the carriers to turn into the wind. 20,000 feet above them, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled Enterprise's dive bomber group, 33 SBD Dauntlesses, nearly out of fuel. He'd flown the course navigation gave him and found empty ocean. He'd turned southwest on a hunch, following a lone Japanese destroyer steaming northeast at flank speed. The destroyer was racing to rejoin the carrier force. McCluskey followed her wake like a highway in the sky. At 10:22 hours, he saw them. 4 carriers in a rough box, 2 miles between ships. White wakes cutting the blue Pacific. Flight decks crowded with aircraft, wings folded, engines warming. Every carrier was turning into the wind for launch. McCluskey radioed, "Enemy carriers!" He split his force without hesitation. He'd take one squadron against the nearest carrier, Kaga. Lieutenant Richard Best would take the other against the second carrier, Akagi. 2 American squadrons, diving from the sun, against the most powerful carrier force in the world. The Japanese were looking down, watching for more torpedo attacks. Their combat air patrol orbited at 10,000 feet, low altitude where the torpedo bombers attacked. Nobody looked up. At 10:25 hours, McCluskey pushed over. The SBD Dauntless Dove at 240 knots, angle near vertical, pilot fighting the stick as air pressure built. The bomb sight was a simple circle of wire. You put the target in the circle, calculated wind and dive angle by instinct, and released at 2,000 feet. Then you pulled out hard enough to gray your vision and prayed the 500-pound bomb went where you aimed it. Japanese carriers presented huge targets, over 800 feet long. But at terminal velocity from 20,000 feet, you had maybe 4 seconds to aim. McCluskey's bomb hit Kaga amidships at 10:26 hours. 500 pounds of Composition B explosive punched through the flight deck into the upper hangar, where torpedoes sat stacked, where aviation fuel lines ran, where armed aircraft sat with engines running. The explosion blew a hole 30 feet across. Fires erupted instantly. 10 seconds later, another bomb hit Kaga aft, then another forward, 3 hits in 30 seconds. Best's squadron dove on Akagi simultaneously. Lieutenant Dick Best himself, leading 3 aircraft, put his bomb through Akagi's flight deck just aft of the midship elevator. The explosion detonated in the upper hangar among 18 armed aircraft being positioned for launch. The bombers' fuel tanks ruptured. Their torpedoes cooked off. The 550-pound bomb stacked in the hangar from the aborted rearmament went up in sympathetic detonation. Akagi's flight deck heaved upward like a steel wave. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo felt the deck shudder. Smoke poured from the hangar. The ship's executive officer reported fires on 3 decks, ammunition detonating, flooding in the engine spaces. At 10:27 hours, 3 minutes after McCluskey's dive, Akagi was done as a fighting ship. She'd taken one bomb. One perfectly placed bomb into a hangar full of armed ordnance and aviation fuel. 3 miles south, Kaga burned from 4 bomb hits. Her crew fought fires in the hangars where torpedoes and bombs cooked off in rolling explosions. Flight deck crews tried to push burning aircraft overboard, but the deck itself was warping from heat. At 10:30 hours, the forward bomb magazine detonated. The explosion blew the bow section open to the sea. At precisely 10:27 hours, the same minute Akagi and Kaga took mortal wounds, Yorktown's dive bombers arrived over the 3rd carrier, Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 SBDs down from 14,500 feet. They'd launched later than Enterprise and Hornets groups, flown a more direct course, and arrived by pure chance at the perfect moment. 3 American dive bomber groups from 3 carriers, launched at different times on different headings, all arrived over the Japanese fleet in a 6-minute window. Leslie's first 3 bombs hit Soryu forward, amidships, and aft. Same result. Hangar fires, ordnance explosions, aviation fuel igniting in rivers of flame that ran through the ship. At 10:30 hours, Soryu's captain ordered abandon ship. The carrier had been combat ready 3 minutes earlier. Now she was an inferno, listing 7 degrees and accelerating, magazines detonating below decks. In 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers had been destroyed. Not damaged. Destroyed. The carriers that burned Pearl Harbor, that drove the British from the Indian Ocean, that made Japan master of the Pacific for 6 months. The finest carrier force ever assembled. The ships that were supposed to be untouchable. 3 of them burning, exploding, dying. 1 remained. Hiru steamed north of the other 3, separated by enough distance that the American dive bombers didn't spot her initially. Her captain, Tomeo Kaku, watched smoke pillars rise from his sister ships and made an instant decision. He didn't wait for orders from Nagumo, who was being evacuated from Akagi's burning bridge. He didn't coordinate with the battleship fleet 300 miles away. He launched everything he had at the American carriers. At 10:40 hours, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters roared off Hiryu's deck. At 12:45 hours, 10 torpedo bombers followed. Hiryu's strike commander, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, followed the American aircraft back toward their carriers. At 1330 hours, he found Yorktown. The carrier that shouldn't have been there, that Navy intelligence reported sunk at Coral Sea, that had been repaired in 3 days instead of 3 months. She stood out, different island structure than Enterprise and Hornet. Kobayashi radioed his bombers. "Attack the one on the left!" Yorktown's radar picked them up at 1335 hours, 47 miles out. Combat Air Patrol scrambled. 12 Wildcats climbed to intercept. The Japanese came in at 18,000 feet, higher than the torpedo bombers. The Wildcats got 7 of them. The remaining 11 pushed over into dives. Yorktown's anti-aircraft batteries opened up. 5-inch guns, 40mm Bofors, 20mm Oerlikons. The sky filled with black bursts and tracer streams. At 13:42 hours, the first bomb hit Yorktown's flight deck. It punched through to the 4th deck and detonated in the uptakes, killing the fires in 5 of her 9 boilers. Yorktown slowed from 30 knots to 6. The second bomb hit 40 seconds later, exploding in the smokestack and showering the deck with burning debris. The third bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the rag storage compartment. Fires erupted. Damage control parties flooded magazines and fought fires. Within 12 minutes, Chief Engineer Jack Delaney had 3 boilers back online. Yorktown accelerated to 20 knots. Her crew thought they might save her. At 14:30 hours, Hiryu's torpedo bombers arrived. 10 Nakajima B-5Ns came in low from 4 directions simultaneously, the kind of coordinated attack American torpedo squadrons couldn't manage. Yorktown turned hard to port to comb the wakes, reducing her profile. She dodged 3 torpedoes. The 4th one, launched from 500 yards by a pilot who held his course through a wall of anti-aircraft fire, hit Yorktown amidships on the port side. The Type 91 warhead, designed to kill battleships, blew a hole 40 feet across below the waterline. The explosion ruptured fuel tanks, shattered the bulkheads, and knocked out the electrical grid. Yorktown listed 11 degrees immediately. Seawater poured into the engine rooms. At 1500 hours, Captain Buckmaster ordered abandon ship. The crew filed off in good order, no panic, textbook evacuation. Destroyers pulled 2,270 men from the water. Buckmaster was the last man off, saluting the flag before stepping onto the destroyer's deck. 200 miles west, Spruance received the report. Yorktown hit, probably sinking. Hiryu still operational. He calculated distances, fuel states, and aircraft availability. Enterprise and Hornet still had dive bombers ready. He knew Hiryu's approximate location from Yorktown's last contact report. At 15:30 hours, he launched a second strike, 24 SBDs from Enterprise, including 10 orphaned Yorktown aircraft that had landed on Enterprise after the first strike. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led them to Hiryu's last known position. They didn't find her. He expanded the search pattern, burning fuel he couldn't afford to waste. At 1700 hours, a scout bomber radioed coordinates. Carrier located, course northwest, speed 25 knots. Gallagher turned his formation toward the contact. Hiryu's lookout spotted the American dive bombers at 17:01 hours. Zeros scrambled to intercept, but too late. The SBDs were already in their dives. At 17:03 hours, the first bomb hit Hiryu's flight deck forward. The second hit 20 seconds later, amidships. The third and fourth bombs hit within 45 seconds. 4 bombs, 4 hits. Same result as her sister ships. Hiryu's hangar became an inferno. Her crew fought the fires for 9 hours, but the forward magazines cooked off at 02:30 hours on June 5th. The explosion broke her keel. At 05:10 hours, Captain Kaku ordered abandon ship. At 0900 hours, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into Hiryu's hull to scuttle her. She rolled over and sank stern first, taking 416 men with her. Captain Kaku went down with his ship, standing on the bridge as the water rose. By dawn on June 5th, all 4 of Nagumo's carriers were gone. Akagi scuttled by Japanese destroyers at 0500 hours after burning all night. Kaga sank at 1925 hours on June 4th, magazines exploding as she went down. Soryu sank at 1913 hours the same day, burning for 7 hours before the sea claimed her. With them went 248 aircraft, the best pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and 6 months of unchallenged victory. The mathematics of the loss staggered the imagination. Japan had started the war with 10 fleet carriers. She'd lost 4 in one day. Training a carrier pilot required 18 months and aviation fuel Japan couldn't spare. Building a fleet carrier required 3 years, and steel Japan didn't have. The Americans were launching Essex-class carriers every 6 months from shipyards that could build them faster than Japan could sink them. Yamamoto, aboard Yamato 500 miles northwest, received the reports in stages, each worse than the last. At 10:50 hours, 3 carriers burning. At 1330 hours, Hiru counterattacking. At 1800 hours, Hiru hit, sinking. He'd planned to annihilate the American carriers with his battleship force, but his battleships never got within 300 miles of an enemy ship. The decisive battle he'd engineered had been decided by dive bombers, dropping 500-pound bombs from 4 miles up. His battleship's 18-inch guns were irrelevant. The Americans never came close enough for surface action. At 02:55 hours on June 5th, Yamamoto canceled the Midway operation and ordered a general withdrawal. The invasion force, 5,000 troops crammed into transport ships, turned west without ever seeing the objective. The battleship fleet, most powerful surface force in the Pacific, retreated without firing a shot. The submarine cordon, positioned to intercept American reinforcements, found empty ocean. The entire operation, weeks of planning, dozens of ships, thousands of men, collapsed because 4 American dive bomber squadrons hit 4 carriers in 6 minutes. Japanese search planes found Yorktown still afloat on the morning of June 5th, listing but not sinking. At 13:31 hours, Japanese submarine WWII-168 put 2 torpedoes into her hull and 1 into the destroyer Hammond alongside. Hammond sank in 4 minutes, depth charges detonating as she went down, killing 81 men. Yorktown finally rolled over at 0701 hours on June 7th and sank in 3,000 fathoms. She'd taken 7 bombs, 2 torpedoes, and 3 days to die. Even in death, she tied down Japanese resources hunting her. The Battle of Midway cost the United States 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. Japan lost 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 men. The numbers told the story, but the strategic implications went deeper. Japan had lost the carriers that gave her offensive reach. She'd lost the pilots who couldn't be replaced. She'd lost the initiative she'd held since Pearl Harbor. Most critically, she'd lost the 6-month window to force a negotiated peace before American industry became unstoppable. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff suppressed news of the defeat. Newspapers reported a great victory at Midway. Wounded survivors from the carriers were isolated in hospitals, forbidden to speak about what happened. The crews of returning ships were scattered to different units. Imperial headquarters announced the destruction of 2 American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, both of which were actually fine, and minimal Japanese losses. The civilian population never learned the truth, but the officers planning Japan's war strategy knew. They'd lost. American intelligence intercepted Japanese damage reports that confirmed the scale of the disaster. 4 fleet carriers sunk. The carrier force that attacked Pearl Harbor destroyed in 1 battle. Rochefort's codebreakers read Japanese naval communications describing the losses, the shock, the desperate attempts to maintain secrecy. The intercepts revealed something else. Japan had no strategic reserve. Her carrier force was gutted. Her pilot training program couldn't replace the losses. Her shipbuilding capacity couldn't match American production. Admiral Spruance received the Medal of Honor recommendation after the battle, but characteristically declined, saying his staff deserved the credit. He'd made the essential decisions. Trust Rochefort's intelligence, position the carriers in ambush, launch at maximum range despite the risks, and pursue aggressively when Hiru remained operational. He'd commanded carriers for the first time in combat and orchestrated the most decisive naval battle in the Pacific War. The Japanese had expected confusion and panic. They got cold calculation and aggressive execution. The torpedo squadrons that died in the first attacks, VT-8, VT-6, VT-3, never knew they'd succeeded. Their sacrifice pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to low altitude, left the carriers vulnerable from above, and disrupted Nagumo's launch cycle at the critical moment. The 41 crews who flew into certain death created the conditions for the dive bomber's success. Ensign George Gay, only survivor of VT-8, floated in the water and watched the Japanese carriers burn from a raft. He was rescued 30 hours later by a PBY Catalina. 15 men in his squadron died so he could see the smoke pillars rising from Kaga's shattered hull. Captain Buckmaster returned to Yorktown on June 6th with a salvage party trying to save his ship. They pumped compartments, corrected the list, rigged tow lines. For 24 hours they thought they might bring her home. Then, I-168's torpedoes ended that hope. Buckmaster watched her sink from a destroyer's deck, the ship he'd commanded for 18 months disappearing beneath the Pacific. She'd fought at Coral Sea, been repaired in 3 days, fought again at Midway, and absorbed punishment that should have killed her 3 times over. Her crew saved over 2,200 men from the water. Her aircraft sank 2 Japanese carriers. She'd done her job. Nagumo survived the battle, but never commanded carriers again. He'd lost the First Air Fleet through a combination of bad luck, poor intelligence, and doctrine that assumed Japanese superiority would overcome any American response. The decision to rearm the second wave for a land attack, then reverse that order when carriers appeared, left his ships vulnerable at precisely the wrong moment. But the fundamental error was strategic, the assumption that Americans would react slowly, incompetently, and predictably. They'd done none of those things. In 6 months, Japan had gone from master of the Pacific to strategic defense. She'd hold islands and fight delaying actions and inflict casualties, but the mathematical reality was settled on June 4th, 1942. The United States would build 24 Essex-class carriers before the war ended. Japan would build 2 fleet carriers total. The Americans would train 60,000 naval aviators. Japan couldn't replace the 110 elite pilots who died at Midway. The battle wasn't just a tactical victory. It was the moment the inevitable became visible. The pilots who attacked the Japanese carriers flew obsolete aircraft. The SBD Dauntless was already being phased out in favor of newer designs, with minimal training and coordination that fell apart as soon as formations launched. They'd still found the enemy, pressed attacks through fighter defenses and anti-aircraft fire, and hit 4 moving targets from 4 miles up while diving at terminal velocity. The Japanese expected American incompetence. They got American adaptability, aggression, and enough skill to capitalize on one perfect moment of opportunity. At 10:26 hours on June 4th, 1942, the war turned. 3 carriers burning. The 4th doomed 3 hours later. The crews who'd attacked Pearl Harbor dying in burning hangars. The pilots who'd driven the British from Ceylon floating in oil-slicked water. The doctrine that assumed Japanese superiority proven fatally wrong. The Americans weren't supposed to be there, weren't supposed to find the carriers, weren't supposed to coordinate attacks from 3 separate task forces at the exact moment the Japanese were most vulnerable. But they were, and they did. And the empire of the rising sun discovered that the sun sets on everyone eventually. Admiral Yamamoto stood on Yamato's bridge as dawn broke on June 5th, receiving confirmation reports. 4 carriers gone, the invasion canceled, the decisive battle lost. He'd warned the Naval General Staff before Pearl Harbor that Japan could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, American industrial capacity would overwhelm them. The clock had been ticking since December 7th, 1941. At Midway, it ran out. The men who flew from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown that day weren't the elite pilots Japan assumed would crumble under pressure. They were kids from Iowa farms and Texas oil fields and New York tenements who'd learned to fly dive bombers and torpedo planes and obsolete fighters because their country needed them to. 41 of them flew into anti-aircraft fire, and 0 interceptors knowing they probably wouldn't come back. They bought 6 minutes for the dive bombers with their lives. That's not propaganda. That's documented in after-action reports and Japanese records and the coordinates where their aircraft hit the water. Subscribe to this channel to keep these stories from fading into history books nobody reads. Hit the like button if you want more tactical breakdowns of how supposed underdogs crushed overconfident powers through skill, timing, and the kind of cold calculation that wins wars. Share this with anyone who needs to understand that underestimation is fatal, that arrogance meets reality eventually, and that the Americans the Japanese dismissed as soft, incompetent, and broken in 1942 destroyed 4 fleet carriers in 6 minutes because they did the math better. The 72 men of Torpedo Squadron 8 earned the Navy Cross for their final attack. Only one survived to receive it. Remember them.